Welcome to Hyperfixation Investigations, the podcast where two neurospicy best friends take time 2 Saturdays a month to info dump their research deep dive of the week.
Lovingly produced and copyrighted by Wolf and Stag Productions.
Today's fun fact is, the saltiest body of water in the world is the Gaytail Pond in Ethiopia, which has a salinity of approximately 43%. That's a salty pond.
Good evening, I'm Kara, and I will be leading this week's episode, Salt. Who says being salty is a bad thing? Part 2 of our mini-series, You Are What You Eat.
Good morning, I'm Josh, and I'm just along for the ride. For those of you joining us for the first time, how things work here is Kara will be guiding us through a mini lecture on the topic, and we'll discuss and ask questions about today's topic throughout the episode.
Expect tangents throughout. We switch off duties each week, so next time expect Josh to helm the episode.
Now to our regularly scheduled program. Kara, what have you been hyperfixating on this week?
Well, Josh, these last few weeks, I've been reading an awesome nonfiction book called Salt, A World History by Mark Kurlansky. And as we both know, salt and salty snacks and electrolyte drinks, etc., are some of my favorite things. Now,
Really?
Shocker, I know. Now, salt is a big topic and actually has far-reaching effects in science, history, religion, and humanity in general. So today we're going to do a bit of an overview of these areas, and then my episode in August will dive more deeply into like one or two specific examples in each of those areas to really try to grasp the overall importance and impact of salt.
Okay, so we're treating this as kind of a two-parter.
Yep.
Cool.
I would highly recommend anyone who likes this podcast, its topic, or how we just in general do our episodes to read and check out this book. I'll link it on the episode blog, and it's pretty much found in every major bookseller. I've also supplemented today and next month's episode with other sources and examples, but Salt, A World History makes this a very approachable, well-organized, and interesting topic, and it's capable of going way more in-depth with way more examples than I can fit in 2 podcast episodes. I'll also have some documentary episodes linked either in this episode or August's, so those go more in-depth about either the history of salt or the science aspect of salt, things like salt lakes, which are just cool. And with all that being said, I think it's time we get cooking.
You know what? You've done worse.
I have definitely done worse.
You've done much worse.
But Josh, today's special because I'm giving you a choice. Do we start on the history overview?
Uh-oh.
Or the science overview?
Ooh. That's tough.
I know.
Especially because I'm particularly bad at choices, typically.
Yes.
How about we start with history, if that's all right?
Yeah, totally.
Cool.
So one of the big things that is kind of crazy about salt is that the first real example that we have of salt as a commodity, as something that's used in food, etc., is from 6000 BC. Yeah. There are records of it having been harvested on the surface of a lake in China, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, so just take that for what it is.
Sure.
And this reference of 6,000, that's from anthropological study as well as written lore.
Mm-hmm.
But the first actual written reference of salt in terms of, hey, we're currently writing about the salt that we're currently using, not just like the history of it, is from somewhere around 2000 BC. And people kind of seem to be on the fence about whether or not it's a Chinese record that came first or if the Book of Job is actually the writing that has the first reference. But those both happened around 3000 to 2000 BC, so it's kind of up for grabs.
And given the scale of civilization at the time of those locations, that makes sense. Either one of them would.
Yeah. So China, part of why it's such a cool civilization is that it's one of our oldest civilizations that has a written record, and its written record actually goes back further than like Mesopotamia or Egypt. So we get these kind of lores and certain historical records that start there. But very quickly, we start moving into the Egyptian timeline with salt. And Egypt was a big user and trader of salt. They use salt in their religious offerings. They use it to mummify people.
Oh, yeah.
They're some of the first to salt food. Now, I will say this. The Chinese have been pickling food for a very long time. But when you think of something like salted cod or preserved things in salt that's
Sure.
just preserved in salt, we're finding that that's more in the Egyptian time.
Sure, but when you say pickling, you are including there is some salt in that, not just...
Right.
Right.
But
Okay.
it's more like a pickling in a brine solution, which usually has some kind of acid in it or something like that.
As opposed to leaving something in a vat or pile of salt itself.
And drying it out.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay.
They also traded saltfish with the Phoenicians,
Ooh.
Mesopotamians, other cultures. And largely the Egyptians are considered the first to have widely traded it at an international level as a commodity, both the
Okay.
food and just salt, though at this point in time, the salted food was worth more than just the salt.
And that makes sense, I suppose. If it's going to keep for a good long time compared to
Right.
most other things. I mean, smoked meats tend to last a good while, but salted,
Yep.
it's got that extra flavor to it.
Yes. We start seeing actual kind of more commercial quote unquote salt production in about 800 BC.
Mhm.
This was again in China. There's a actually very interesting correlation between salt production and iron and the use of iron.
Oh, okay.
In salt production and in making it more commercialized. Traditionally, it was you would take salt water and put it in clay vessels and boil it, and then you would get the salt crystals.
Yeah.
The water would boil away. And I'm not going to go into the whole science and in-depth stuff of the iron, but one of the big ways they started to commercialize it was with using different iron cooking implementations and things like that instead of clay.
They could kind of industrialize their salt
Mhm.
boiling process.
Yep.
It makes sense for a large vat.
So we also have kind of the beginning of the politics of salt. Obviously,
Oh!
Egyptians and trade, there's going to be some politics going on there. But
Trade is never political. I don't know what you're talking about.
No. Around this like 900 to 200 BC mark
Mhm.
in China is when we start seeing emperors trying to create state salt monopolies
Oh my gods.
in order to, have a lot of income coming into the state. It's often, there's kind of this oscillation back and forth between it being a state monopoly and then people being really against it being a state monopoly. And so it gets democratized again. And then they'll go to war or they decide to expand someplace, which is essentially the same thing. And then they need money for their military. And so they make it a state monopoly again and so on and so forth.
Okay. It's kind of this recurring source of cash that, like, every once in a while they just go, hey, we just need to tap into the strategic reserve of
Yep.
money that's under this rock right here. Let me
Mhm.
just... Yeah, it's fair.
Yeah. And while this is happening, the Egyptians have continued trading. One of the really interesting things about Egypt and salt is that they have access to multiple types of salt. So they have sea salt from the Nile Delta.
Sure.
They also have what's called red salt, which they found in Memphis, which is near modern day Cairo.
Right.
And then they also have what's called natron. And there's
Okay.
white and red natron, and we'll go more into the science of those in the next episode.
Okay.
But they're two different types of salts, closely related. And
The natrons? Okay.
yes. And it's kind of up in the air about whether or not natrons were used in mummification or if sodium chloride, which is what we think of as table salt,
Yeah.
the regular stuff we find, if that was used, because natrons leave trace deposits of sodium chloride behind anyway.
Oh, sure.
And what archaeologists are kind of trying to figure out is whether or not the natrons were used for higher class
Mhm.
mummification and just regular sodium chloride was used for lower class. So there's that going on. So the Egyptians had these 4 different types of salts very readily at their fingertips. And between China and Egypt, the ways of processing salt, which the sea salt method of collecting seawater and boiling it off, or if you're living in someplace hot like Africa, finding salt lakes that are kind of, salt beds and things like that are just mineable essentially as they are kind of the big ways of doing salt at this point in time.
That's fair.
And it's being traded with the Middle East, with the Mediterranean, and as Europe becomes more prevalent, into Europe as well.
Fair. And I'm sorry, did you say where the red salt was coming from?
Memphis,
Yeah, no, but
Egypt.
like...
Cairo.
yes, but like Memphis, the location, I don't know what that means for like where they were pulling it out of, you know?
Yeah. The lake near Memphis.
Okay.
And the Egyptians called what we call table salt, sodium chloride,
Mhm.
northern salt.
Northern, right, because it was from.
The north, the Nile Delta. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. And I'm sorry if you're going to go into this in the next episode,
no,
that's
you're good.
fine, but was red salt just red tinged sodium chloride, or was it something like magnesium chloride or calcium chloride? Was it a different type of salt?
See, he wants to start with history, and then he asks,
I'm curious by nature. I'm sorry. There's so many different types of salt. I gotta know.
you gotta know.
Or is it just communist salt?
Right.
The original communist salt from ancient Egypt.
Well, if Google would load, we could live fact check. So we'll figure that out later.
Cool. So we'll cover that next episode, I suppose then.
We'll get into it.
Okay.
I'll write it down as a note.
Fair enough.
So once we get into the 80s, you know, the 80s.
Into the 80s.
The 80s.
Into the Common Era.
Yes. You start getting more stuff with Europe and India. New technologies start coming through. And then really, you know, that's just kind of like the 1200s to 1700s. Kind of just like salt's being traded a lot. People are desperate for it. There are like 3 or 4 ways to get it that have become pretty natural. The more you have, richer you are, et cetera, et cetera.
Everybody loves salt.
You start finding it in religions, which we'll get to a little bit later. Where you start getting a lot of technological advancement starts in like the 1700s. And you start getting really like public works and stuff like that that are geared towards the finding and refining and distribution of salt.
Sure.
You, of course, get the British doing all the stuff they like to do.
A lot of colonialism.
Yeah, like 1776 when the British cut off the supply of salt to Washington's army.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yes. The Erie Canal was actually one of those great public works for getting salt into the U.S.
Was it really?
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
It's called the ditch that salt built.
The ditch that salt built?
Because salt revenue is essentially what funded building it.
No, that makes sense.
And that was in the mid-1800s.
Given how valuable salt has been for most of human history.
Yes. And then you start seeing in the 1800s as well, things like ice being used to preserve food instead of salt. And so you start seeing salt production go down a little bit. And around this time, though more so in the 1900s, but between the 1800s and the 1900s, scientists and geologists and business people start figuring out that salt's actually way more readily available than we thought. So there's no premium on it anymore because people can kind of get it anywhere.
Yeah, it's fair. Along with the, I'm sure, advent of industrialized refrigeration.
Yep. Freon in the 1920s was a big one because that goes into refrigerators.
Should not go into the atmosphere, but that's a separate issue.
Yeah. You've got the frozen food industry.
The frozen food injury. Yes, my favorite.
Also in the 1920s. But salt by then is ubiquitous. We're finding it everywhere. People are literally making it out of their, in their own backyards at this point if they want it. A lot of those ancient techniques are very accessible to people to just do. We're finding it other places. We're doing different manufacturing methods. And so it becomes just an everyday product.
Yeah.
So that kind of is the general thing. To kind of recap it, we've got the ancient times from 6000 BC to about 500 AD-ish. Ancient Egypt, the Chinese dynasties, the Roman Empire, etc. Finding salt as a precious commodity, using it in religion, using it in food, using it in trade as actual coinage, essentially.
Yeah.
For health, etc. We've got the Middle Ages, 500 to about 1500, where we have, again, upcroppings of it in different religions, trade. It's still seen as something that is at a premium. It's hard to find. It's for the wealthy. Age of exploration. We've got people expanding into all kinds of places in colonial empires and finding out that salt's everywhere. So you're getting a lot more salt into the trade. It's also becoming more accessible to the masses. though, and this means competition was increasing as well. And then modern, which is about 1800 to now. We've got the Industrial Revolution. So the production of salt was hugely transformed. It was commercialized at a mass amount. And we have salt going far beyond the kitchen into technologies, healthcare.
Yeah.
It's in a lot of pharmaceuticals. And again, it's become a modern day, everyday item at that point.
Yeah. Quick question.
Yeah.
Just dipping back into the ancient for a second, and again, apologies if this is something you're going to cover in the next episode.
Yeah.
I've heard this said before, and I don't know if this is apocryphal or not. So I'm curious if this came up in your research as to the origin of the phrase, a person being worth their salt.
It hasn't come up in my research.
Really?
No,
Okay.
not yet, at least.
Because I've heard that supposedly, at least, and again,
Google's not loading, so I can't tell you shit.
cool. I've heard that supposedly the origin of somebody being worth their salt is that the Roman Empire at one point paid their soldiers partly in salt. And so a soldier being good at their job, they were literally worth their salt. Again, I don't know.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, the amount that it's used as a commodity to pay for things, the amount that it was valued in those times,
Yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised by it, but I am writing down the questions.
fair. And given the scope of the Roman Empire's ability to collect salt at the height of their size
Right.
and logistical capabilities. But that could also just be people who are way too into the Roman Empire going, oh yeah, that's totally what that is.
We don't know people like that.
Though again, because it is Rome, it wouldn't surprise me.
Okay. So just a few other things kind of on the history of salt.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very good quote from Salt World History and Mark Kurlansky, which is about the 17th and 18th century North America, just kind of in general, this idea of the shift from hunter-gatherer to agricultural civilizations going back to ancient times. But this idea that, quote, wherever records exist of humans in different stages of development, it's generally found that hunter tribes neither made nor traded for salt, but agricultural tribes did. On every continent, once human beings began cultivating crops, they began looking for salt to add to their diet, unquote.
Interesting.
So,
But also makes sense if once you know where to find it, you keep going back to those same spots.
yeah,
And it's easier to find salt in a place you've already, settled.
it is. What they also have found is that, for the most part, hunter-gatherer tribes were able to get their salt cravings essentially covered by what they were finding in wild meat. But when you start moving to a grain and vegetable heavy diet, people were starting to lack in salt and starting to crave it more. And so then people started trading for it.
Sure, that makes sense.
And they would follow animals because animal trails eventually always lead to a salt lick, especially for herbivores. Carnivores can typically get their salt content from what they eat as well, but deer and lots of other animals that are herbivores need salt licks. And so people would either find salt licks or brine ponds or things like that.
Salty caves.
Yep. And
Keep it in the food chain.
Right. And with agriculture, we also started to domesticate animals, and animals also need salt. And so having regular access to salt was important in the domestication of animals. There's an example in this book as well about reindeer and how,
Oh my God.
reindeer have never been fully domesticated, but they have become, herded animals. And part of how people started to be around them a lot more is that they were attracted to the salt in human urine.
Ah! Oh no, wait. No.
Yeah,
Are you saying
Yes.
Rudolph has a piss kink?
I do.
Oh, I kind of hate that.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But also that's fascinating.
Right? And so when you start domesticating dogs and sheep and horses and cattle, who, horses need something like 5 times the amount of salt humans do. Cattle need something like 10
Oh my
times the amount of these. So,
Well, they are large.
right, they are very large. So if you were going to domesticate animals, you needed ready access to salt as well. So within the history of salt, we'll also talk just briefly in this episode about some of the religious connections to salt, some of the symbolisms. We'll go a little bit more in depth into some of them in the next episode. But
I mean, Supernatural taught me that a line of salt can keep ghosts away.
Can. Some of the kind of more modern religions,
Sure.
you've got Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Catholicism. You find in Judaism the symbolism of salt as the eternal nature of God's covenant with Israel.
Huh.
You have in Islam and Judaism salt being used to seal bargains.
Oh.
Indian troops pledged their loyalty to the British with salt. Salt was included in ancient religions for sacrifices and offerings, as well as invoking gods, which the Romans' use of salt and water together was thought to maybe be the origin of Christian holy water.
Oh, sure.
And the Catholic Church dispenses not only holy water, but holy salt, sal
sapientia?
Sal sapientia.
Cool.
Yeah, which is the salt of wisdom, which is another one of its symbologies.
It makes sense seeing it in religious practices, especially as a form of sacrifice or a form of something you're giving up that is valuable because it's valuable for the sake of whomever you worship.
Right.
Which is a pretty common ideal.
And then we also have certain symbolic kind of representations of preservation, not just for food, but also for things like mummies, protecting against decay. You know, we find more wood building structures in areas that have high sand and salt contents.
Yeah, where it's been salt petrified.
Yep.
Nice.
Or like there's a partially petrified, well, it is fully petrified, but it's like half of the tree height of a forest off of the coast of, I think it's Washington State in the US. A big tsunami and the land ended up shifting down and being flooded and whatever. And so now when the tide is out, you see essentially a half-felled forest of petrified tree trunks still in the ground out on the edge of this cliff.
Love that.
Which is cool. It also has kind of a metaphorical importance with longevity and permanence. We've got the idea of because it prevents decay, it can protect from harm, which is also kind of tied into the evil spirits detest it. It protects against the evil eye. So it's very much a symbol of wealth in a lot of communities, but it's also very much a symbol of like protection and preservation and boundaries and safety and all those kinds of things.
I do just find it interesting how pervasive its symbolism and use gets as a result of its usefulness.
Well, and it's not, you know, we need salts to live.
Yeah.
You know, like we need electrolytes and it helps with our bodies maintaining homeostasis and all that kind of stuff. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason living animals and living creatures require salts and it's in such abundance and, you know. But yeah, this is another good quote from the book. Quote, "The figure often cited by the modern salt industry in terms of uses of salt is nearly 14,000 uses, including the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, the melting of ice from winter roads, fertilizing agricultural fields, making soap, softening water, and dyeing textiles," unquote. As well as the food, the preservation, the mummy making, the wealth commodity, you know, all of that.
Right. This is all types of salt. It's not just sodium chloride, because I know some of those off the top of my head do not use sodium chloride.
Yes.
Or at least not typically. Some of them really shouldn't. Some of them, there's just other salts that are better suited, but like especially roads.
Yeah. And as you said, there are many types of salts. Many of them are edible. They can often be found in the same places. I think there was something like over 40 that are regularly used in different aspects of life.
I'd buy that.
Which I think is a good kind of segue into our science section.
Yes.
I don't know about you, Josh, but I've worked up a sweat. I think it's time for a salty snack and a water break.
For those who appreciate social media updates and episode reminders, please follow us on YouTube at Hyperfixation Investigations Podcast, or Blue Sky at HI-Podcast, or sign up for our email list at our website and ensure you never miss a thing.
And please leave a comment or review on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or even on our website. We love to hear from you and it helps us a lot. If you would like to contribute to us directly and help us continue growing, consider subscribing to our podcast on Patreon. Now I think it's time to shake ourselves back to the episode. All right, salt. I'm going to do, this will be fast. But I feel like I also need to preface this section
Okay.
with the, I'm not the scientist out of the two of us.
That's fair. That's fair.
And this is a lot of, I had to like reach in my brain for high school chemistry for half of what I'm about to say to make sense. So
That's so fair.
and I feel like for me, the science makes more sense when I start doing the case analysis, which we'll do in the next episode, where it's like actually applied and I'm not just giving you the background of salts are ionic compounds.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, I can try to help out a little bit here and there, but I also don't want to take over your episode. So I'm going to leave you mostly to fend for yourself. You're
Thanks
welcome.
so much.
I believe in you.
We'll be fine. All right. So salts are ionic compounds resulting from a reaction between an acid and a base that kind of neutralize each other, right? I'm so sorry for the chemistry flashbacks for all of you theater and art people. I'm with you.
I'm just sitting here amused and impressed already.
pH works backwards from how I think it should.
It does, and it's not an absolute scale either.
No. Anyway, pH actually doesn't have much to do with what we're talking about, but that was one of the few things I remember from chemistry, so you're welcome.
Fair.
Salts in chemistry are not just the salt that we think of when we think of eating salt. You know, we have sodium chloride, basic table salt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got iodized salt and sea salts and kosher salts and fleur de sel, and there's all kinds of different salts that we do eat, Himalayan rock salt even.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people cook salmon on slabs of that and whatever, or they try in my mother's case.
It was an admirable attempt, I will say, in your mother's defense.
It was a good thing there were potatoes. That's all I'm going to say.
Hey, potatoes. They fix so many. Potatoes fix so many salty
They
situations.
really do. We need to. We will go off on a tangent on potatoes, and we've had too many tangents in this episode that you're going to have to cut out anyway.
Well, that's just it. Most of them aren't making it into the episode anyway.
Because they make no sense compared to the episode. Anyway, so usually salt is formed by this reaction with a strong base and a weak acid.
Mm-hmm.
That's a basic salt, right? Base,
Yeah.
basic.
It's pretty basic.
Don't start with me.
I haven't
Conversely-
even. I surrender?
Good. Correct answer. Conversely, acidic salts are when you have a strong acid and a weak base.
Yeah, makes sense.
And when they're equal, it's neutral. Okay?
Where is the imbalance toward the acids, toward the bases?
Make
There's your
acidic
answer.
or basic salts.
And
Correct.
if there is no imbalance,
We're not
really-
getting into double salts or other stuff like that. Nobody needs to know that.
But they're so much fun.
I don't care.
Okay.
So one of the big things about the science of salt, right, is yes, there's all the chemistry names and the different types of them. We're used to sodium chloride, which is sodium Na, chloride Cl.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever you see the NaCl, that's salt. But these salts, both sodium chloride and others, have biological functions. So typically as electrolytes, which enable neural signals to be transmitted to muscles and organs, vice versa. The neural signals also control voluntary and involuntary movements of muscle. So things like blinking, moving your fingers, all that kind of stuff.
Which is part of why they're really good to ingest after a workout.
Right. And they transmit information from sense organs like the eyes and tongue and regulate releases of hormones in the endocrine system. So we've got that. That's kind of our biological idea of salt, why we and herbivores and carnivores and all kinds of living creatures require salt. So in chemistry specifically, salt can be inorganic or organic compound. And it has ionic bonds, which are like, I always thought of them as like an analogy of being like magnetic in that they were stronger bonds. And salts typically dissolve in water. And this dissolving of salts into different solutions, which water would be one, is how electrolytes can conduct electricity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot that salt does, right? And salts of different forms.
And salty waters of different salinities, so of different like levels of saltiness per amount of water. will transmit electricity differently.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the different types of chemistry salts that I had talked about, which is kind of what I'm going to call salts that aren't the food salt we think about.
Sure. And I mean, that's not necessarily disqualifying the fact that there are other salts than sodium chloride that are edible.
Right.
You're just saying anything other than sodium chloride, you're going to call chemistry salts.
Yes.
Okay.
So we've got the acidic salts, which I had mentioned before. Those have a strong acid, weak base. One that may sound familiar to people would be sodium carbonate. And then a basic salt that people might recognize, which again is then the strong base, weak acid, would be sodium acetate or potassium cyanide. Potassium often is correlated with salts as well. I've seen throughout the science-y stuff.
Yeah, potassium chloride can sometimes be a good like finishing salt if you're trying to reduce the amount of sodium in your diet. Right? Like I know my dad does that. And I've been doing that a little bit. Not a ton, but a little bit here and there. Though it doesn't take the place of sodium chloride in most like baking reasons.
Right.
So you probably should still use that for those applications. But if you just want a little like salty flavor, but you're like, I should cut back on sodium, then potassium chloride is a pretty good
substitute.
Substitute.
And then there's the neutral salts. We had talked about the ones where the base and the acids are neutral. The one that probably would sound the most familiar to people is sodium nitrate.
Oh, yeah.
That one's in fertilizers. I know that much.
Yep.
So this is from the reagent chemical manufacturer. I'm just going to read this little blurb about tastes with salt because I think it kind of does a good job giving you the spectrum. So, quote, although many salts have a characteristic salty taste, others have a very different flavor. Lead diacetate can be sweet tasting, but is poisonous. Magnesium sulfate is bitter, and potassium bitartrate is sour. Monosodium glutamate has a savory flavor, which highlights the taste of other food ingredients.
MSG.
Umami.
Oh, it's so good.
We love it so much.
And also, it's nowhere near as bad for you
as people think it is.
No, that's mostly just racism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Salts
it's perfectly fine.
It's totally fine. And salts come in all kinds of different colors. We've got the white salt we're used to seeing. You've got Himalayan pink salts. There's black salts. There's yellow salts. Some of the interesting things is that all salts, for the most part, are highly soluble in water, as well as other types of solvents. Molten salts, which I'm not going to get into, but just no. Molten salts and solutions of salts conduct electricity because of the ionic and polar properties, which we kind of briefly went over. And salts tend to have a very high melting point due to the strength of their ionic bonds. So like table salt has a melting point of 801 degrees Celsius. I'm not even going to try to make that in Fahrenheit. So it's
hot. Yeah. As a random tangent regarding molten salts, I know there is at least one like nuclear lab, I think in China, that has been looking into using thorium salt.
Okay.
Like molten thorium salt as part of a nuclear reactor.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And again, it's been a while since I've looked into this, but I seem to remember that it was mostly about making a like smaller, stable reactor with less nuclear waste.
That'd be cool.
Yeah. But I don't remember the details off the top of my head, so that might come into play in a later nuclear power episode. Thorium salt is weird, though, but it's also nowhere close to being adapted to like the end-all be-all of
course,
standardized nuclear reactor stuff. It's cool, but eh.
Yeah. So some of the other practical science aspects of salts is things like sodium chloride, your basic table salt, can be used in manufacturing to produce other chemical products like sodium bicarbonate, sodium hydroxide, chlorine, and hydrochloric acid, which I think all of those would probably sound familiar to most people in our audience. It can also be used in soap, porcelain, and enamel manufacturing. It can be used in metallurgical processes because it can encourage metals to fuse. Other salts like sodium hypochlorite make very good cleaning and bleaching agents. We've talked about how we've got salts in our own systems. It helps with cellular integrity, those neural pathways, the electrolytes, all of that. And then we also have some interesting little examples of different applications of different types of salt. So, again, preserving food, seasoning, other manufacturing things, we've got sodium chloride. MSG, it's used to make food more savory and enhance flavor. Sodium nitrate, commonly used in the manufacturing of explosives and fertilizers. Potassium permanganate.
Potassium permanganate.
Potassium permanganate.
Mm-hmm.
It's used in treating some skin conditions, typically fungal infections.
Yeah, it's usually pretty good with those.
You could also use it to synthesize things like ascorbic acid.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are a lot of other ones. The interesting thing about salts in chemistry, in fertilizers, in production, is that as good as they are, as certain types of them in particular are for us and for other animals, other types are very not good. Like I'd mentioned earlier, the lead diacetate, totally poisonous. But we also have environmental considerations. So the salt, like potassium chloride or potassium sulfate that are in fertilizers, when they run off into the ocean or other water sources, they can cause eutrophication. And this is the algal bloom and overproduction of bacteria within our oceans and water cycles. And that can then deplete the amount of dissolved oxygen in water, which can kill a lot of marine organisms.
Yeah, death by asphyxiation.
It's the interesting kind of other side of salt, as something that we think of as kind of ubiquitous, daily use. Most of us eat and consume a fair amount of it.
In many forms for both of those.
But, you kind of have this flip side of there are still negative versions of it and negative effects. And, any doctor will tell you if you eat too much salt, that's not good for you either,
Yeah, and I know that with some of the toxic salts, some of them are toxic because they're too similar to sodium chloride as far as our body's ability to identify them. Oh. So it'll attempt to absorb them the way it would normal salt, but it just ends up not working out. Right. Yeah. It ends up poisoning the cells.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Not all salts that are toxic, but at least some of them. And I don't remember which ones off the top of my head.
So don't eat salt you don't recognize.
I would say in general, don't eat a rock you don't recognize.
Don't be like geologists. Anyway, don't lick things that you don't know what they are.
I will say, though, it's very impressive how many geologists can tell with such high degree of accuracy what a rock is made out of just by licking it once and going, it's probably got some of this in it. I think there's a deposit of this in this rock. That's insane.
Yep.
That's incredibly impressive.
Yep. Geologists are cool.
Yeah.
But kind of to wrap up our science of salts, we have one more quote from the book, Salt of World History by Mark Kurlansky. Quote, modern scientists argue about how much salt an adult needs to be healthy. Estimates range from 2/3 of a pound to more than 16 pounds a year, unquote. And he goes on to talk about how people in hot climates or those who work outdoors or in hard labor often need more salt because they lose a lot of it while they're sweating and keeping their body safe in homeostasis.
Right. It's really hard to make any kind of hard and fast rule about how much of anything every human needs because health is so individual, based even on your biology and your lifestyle.
Right.
Oy.
And then you have those who sweat less. Generally, they can get what they need from eating red meat or having a otherwise balanced diet, and they don't need to be actively seeking out more. For someone like myself and a lot of other women my age who are dealing with something like POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, we are encouraged to eat more salt and to drink more electrolytes because our body doesn't regulate properly, which causes fainting and dizziness and other things like that. And keeping up our salt content can be very helpful. So, everybody, like you said, has their own needs and it's going to be different for everybody. But yeah, I think one last quote from the book will be a good little end to our overview episode here. I think it does a really nice job of kind of summing up the important parts of what we talked about today, setting us up well for stuff we'll talk about next month.
Hell yeah.
Which is, quote, the search for salt has challenged engineers for millennia and created some of the most bizarre, along with some of the most ingenious machines. A number of the greatest public works ever conceived were motivated by the need to move salt. Salt has been in the forefront of the development of both chemistry and geology. Trade routes that have remained major thoroughfares were well established, alliances were built, empires secured, and revolutions provoked, all for something that fills the ocean, bubbles up from springs, form crusts in lake beds, and thickly veins a large part of the Earth's rock fairly close to the surface. Almost no place on Earth is without salt, but this was not clear until revealed by modern geology, and so, for all of history until the 20th century, salt was desperately searched for, traded for, and fought over. For millennia, salt represented wealth. Salt is so easy to obtain, so common, and so inexpensive that we've forgotten that from the beginning of civilization until about 100 years ago, it was one of the most sought-after commodities in human history. Unquote.
Love that.
So I think that's most of our salt overview episode here. I want to give one more shout out to Mark Kalansky and Salt a World History because it's been fascinating to read this book. I'm really excited to go more in depth with all of you guys next month on examples from both his book and from my own research outside of it. And I think it's just good to point out sometimes that there are these things we think of as just common, everyday, don't need to think about it kind of things that have had such long-reaching and huge effects on, like, literally humanity as a whole.
There's a ton of stuff that we just take for granted because it's part of our
sure.
everyday lives. Like, yeah, it's just how it's always been as far as we're concerned.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that wraps up Salt Overview.
Oh, I will say real quick.
Oh, yes.
Regarding that last quote, that pretty clearly sums up one of the reasons that I really enjoy, and I've told you about this a dozen times before, and I think I've even sent you part of the text of this, but there's an old Dungeons & Dragons story of people who played a game of D&D that, in my opinion, was almost hyper-realistic insofar as the entire game became about a salt mine.
Right. You've mentioned it. But yeah, I love it.
Because one guy just decided, wait a minute, why are we out here fighting monsters and demons and elementals when there's a salt mine here that we could just become entrepreneurs of the salt mine and get rich? And then they end up in a multi-year campaign of setting up trade routes and mining operations and building up a mining town around the salt mine, and D&D style chaos ensues.
Of course.
But all for the sake of,
it's a salt mine.
We run a salt mine. This is an incredibly profitable venture, and we have to protect our trade routes along the way from banditry and whatnot because it's highly valuable. I, for some reason, had forgotten about it until you started talking about that chunk of the book. And I went, yeah, I suppose it's an oddly realistic D&D campaign from this old classic story. I don't know when that occurred, but
it's so fun, though.
Yeah, from the annals of internet history at this point.
Of all the things to mine, salt is still should be the choice.
Oh, yeah. Hey, people always need salt.
Yeah, and there's way more of it than most other things you mine. Yeah. So you're not going to run out. So investing advice from Josh and Kara. Open a salt mine.
Yep.
We are in no way investing professionals. Don't take anything we say seriously. All right.
No.
And with that, thanks so much for listening. That's our salt episode.
That's a wrap on episode 19, Salt. If you'd like to delve further into this topic, our research sources and related images are posted on our website, hyperfixation-investigations.com. Again, that is hyperfixation-investigations.com. Thanks so much for listening.
Follow us on social media for updates and check out our Patreon to support us directly, join our Discord community, and receive other special perks.
See you next week. And remember, what's a little info dumping between friends?